There is a place on this earth that maps tried to forget. I know that sounds like the start of a tall tale, the kind of thing an old man says to get your attention before he tells you something far less interesting than the opening promised. But I am 100 years old now, and I do not have time left to waste your attention or mine on tall tales. What I am going to tell you happened. I was there. I am the only one left who was, and I think that means I owe it to someone, somewhere, to finally say it out loud before I can't say anything at all. In the spring of 1936, I was 26 years old, and I considered myself an explorer, though looking back, I think that word gave me more credit than I deserved. I was really just a restless young man with some training in surveying and cartography, a strong back, and a stubborn refusal to believe that every corner of the world had already been mapped and catalogued and closed up neat. I'd read about expeditions into South America, into the high passes of Asia, and something in me wanted that. Wanted to find something nobody else had found. I joined a small expedition that spring funded by a university back east with the modest goal of surveying and mapping a remote mountain range that, even by the standards of 1936, was poorly understood. I won't tell you exactly where. I've thought about that decision for 60, 70 years, and I still believe it's the right one. Not because I'm protecting myself, because I'm protecting whatever might still be there. There were 4 of us when we set out. By the time I came down out of those mountains, I was alone. And I have never, in all the decades since, told anyone the complete truth of why. We spent almost 2 months working our way up through foothills and then into proper high country, the kind of terrain where the air gets thin and your thoughts start playing tricks on you if you're not careful. We lost one man to altitude sickness early on. He had to be sent back down with a local guide, and I never learned what became of him afterward, which is its own small sadness I still carry. The remaining 3 of us pushed on, following a route that our maps, such as they were, showed as simply blank, just empty space where the cartographers had given up and drawn nothing at all. It was in that blank space that we found the valley. I remember the moment we came over the ridge and saw it below us, because it didn't feel like discovery so much as it felt like being allowed to see something. That's a strange way to put it, I know, but that's exactly how it felt. The valley sat low between 2 arms of the mountain range, sheltered in a way that explained why no one passing through at a distance would ever have spotted it. And in the center of that valley, impossibly, was a city, not ruins. Not the kind of forgotten stone foundations that explorers occasionally stumbled across in those days and got briefly famous for. This was a living city. Smoke rising from chimneys. Fields cultivated in neat terraces along the valley floor. Stone buildings with proper roofs, proper streets between them, the unmistakable signs of people going about an ordinary day far below us. I want you to understand what that meant in 1936, to men who believed, as most people did then, that the world had basically run out of places to hide. We stood on that ridge for a long time without speaking. I remember my hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. It took us the better part of a day to make our way down into the valley, and by the time we did, the light was going soft and gold the way it does in the mountains just before evening. We were exhausted, half-starved, filthy from weeks on the trail, and we walked into that city not really knowing what to expect. Hostility, perhaps, or fear, or the kind of cautious curiosity that isolated peoples often showed toward strangers. What we got instead was welcome, genuine, warm, immediate welcome, the kind that almost embarrassed us with its generosity. They gave us food before we'd even managed to explain who we were. They gave us a place to sleep in a stone guest house near the center of the city, with real beds and real blankets, after weeks of sleeping on rock and frozen ground. The people spoke a language none of us recognized, though a handful of the older residents had some fragments of Spanish enough that we could manage a halting, simplified kind of communication. They called the city by a name that I will not repeat here, partly because I'm not confident I ever heard it correctly, and partly because some things I've come to believe are better left unspoken. I will just call it the city, the way I came to think of it myself before too long, not because it had no name, but because the name began to feel like something I wasn't entitled to use. For the first several days I was simply enchanted. I think the other two men felt the same way. We told ourselves we had found something extraordinary, a community untouched by the modern world, preserved in some pure and beautiful isolation, and we filled notebooks with observations about their agriculture, their architecture, their customs. I was young and I was thrilled, and it took me embarrassingly long to notice what should have been obvious from the very first afternoon. Nobody in that city looked old. I don't mean that everyone happened to be young. I mean that there was no variation. I saw people who appeared to be in something like their 30s or 40s, plenty of them, robust and capable, working the fields and tending the animals and managing the daily business of the city. I saw children, a reasonable number of them, playing in the narrow streets the way children do everywhere. But I did not see, in all the days we spent there at first, a single person with grey hair. Not one stooped back. Not one face lined deep with age, the way faces get lined after 60 or 70 years of living. Not one person using a cane, or moving with the careful slowness that age forces on all of us eventually, myself very much included these days. I mentioned this to one of my companions, a quiet, thoughtful man named Walter Greaves, on perhaps our 5th or 6th night there. We were sitting outside the guest house in the cool evening air, and I said something like, "Have you noticed there are no old people here?" And Walter looked at me for a long moment before answering, and what he said has stayed with me for 90 years. He said, "I've noticed there's no one sick either." And once he said it, I couldn't stop seeing it. No one with a limp from an old injury healed wrong. No one with the rattling cough that was common enough back home, especially among people who worked outdoors their whole lives. No one missing teeth. No one with the particular weariness that illness or age presses into a person's eyes. Every single person in that city moved and looked and breathed like someone in the absolute prime of their health, regardless of how old they otherwise appeared to be. We asked carefully, through our limited shared vocabulary, how old some of the residents were. The answers we got were vague in a way that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Gestures toward the mountains, toward the sky, smiles that seemed kind but gave nothing away. One older-seeming man, who I'd guess was meant to represent something like a village elder, simply said, through one of the few residents with workable Spanish, that time moved differently for his people. I wrote that down in my journal exactly as it was translated to me, and I have read that sentence back to myself more times than I can count in the decades since, trying to decide whether it meant something profound or whether it was simply a polite way of telling outsiders to stop asking questions they had no right to ask. There was another detail, smaller at first, that took me longer to notice properly, though once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it every single night for the rest of our stay. Every evening, at what I came to recognize as almost exactly the same hour, every single light in that city went out at once. I don't mean that people generally went to bed around the same time, the way you'd expect in a farming community without electricity where everyone rises and sleeps according to the sun. I mean that the lanterns and the lamps and the small fires that lit windows throughout the city, and there were a great many of them scattered across dozens of buildings tended by dozens of different households, all of them went dark within what felt like the same handful of seconds. Walter and I tested this more than once, watching from the small window of our guest house with my pocket watch open between us. 3 nights running, the lights died across the entire city, within roughly the same 30-second span, every single night, like something had reached out and pressed a single switch for the whole town at once. After the lights went out, the city did not simply go quiet the way a sleeping town goes quiet. It went still in a way that I have never found the right words for, even after 90 years of trying. I would lie awake in that guest house in the total blackness, and I would feel, not hear, feel, a kind of pressure in the air, a sense that something was happening in the darkness outside that I was not meant to see. I told myself it was simply the unfamiliarity of the place working on my nerves. I told myself that for longer than I should have. It was around the second week that the third member of our party, a cartographer named Henry Voss, went missing. He had gone out by his own account to the others before he left to make some final notes on the eastern edge of the city before full dark. He did not come back that night. He did not come back the next morning. Walter and I searched as much of the surrounding area as the residents would permit, and I want to be honest, there were places they very clearly steered us away from, gently but firmly, places along the eastern ridge, and especially toward a series of stone structures at the lowest point of the valley that nobody would discuss with us at all. We never found Henry Voss. The residents expressed what seemed like genuine sorrow about it, brought us food, sat with us, offered comfort in the limited language we shared, but nobody offered an explanation, and when we pressed, and we did press, as hard as two frightened, grieving young men reasonably could, in a place where we did not speak the language and had no real power of our own, we were met with the same gentle, immovable wall of vagueness that I had already come up against when asking about age and illness. I learned much later, in fragments pieced together over years of reading and research after I'd returned to civilization, that Henry Voss was not the first outsider to vanish in those mountains. There were old accounts, missionary records, a handful of half-credible expedition logs from the previous century, the kind of thing that gets filed away in archives and never properly investigated, describing travelers in that region who went in and never came back out, with no bodies ever found, no explanation ever offered. I cannot tell you with certainty that all of those vanished travelers found their way into that same valley. I can only tell you that the pattern unsettled me enough that I spent years quietly tracking it down, long after I had any business still thinking about that place at all. It was around this same time, in the aftermath of Henry's disappearance, that I started keeping a much more careful journal than the official survey notes I was supposed to be producing. A private record of everything that felt wrong, everything that didn't add up, every small detail that the official report would never have room for. I still have that journal. I'm looking at pages of it as I tell you this. My handwriting, from 90 years ago, jagged in places where my hand was clearly not steady. In that journal I wrote down something that happened maybe 3 nights after Henry vanished. I'd woken in the deep dark, sometime well after the lights had gone out across the city, to the sound of voices outside, not loud, not alarming on their own, just the low murmur of people talking somewhere in the streets. I went to the window. I could see almost nothing, the night was that complete, but I could make out shapes moving along the main street of the city, dozens of them walking together in a slow, deliberate procession toward the eastern edge of town, toward the lowest part of the valley, toward the exact area they had steered us away from during our daylight search for Henry. I did not go out to look closer. I want to be honest about that, because I think a younger version of myself, in a story I was just listening to instead of living, would have gone out to investigate, would have followed at a careful distance, would have been the brave explorer the whole tale seemed to be asking for. I did not do that. I stood at that window with my heart slamming against my ribs, and I did not move until the sounds had faded entirely and the night had gone properly silent again. I am not ashamed of that anymore. I think it may be the reason I am alive to tell you this story at all. The next development came about 10 days later, and it is the piece of this whole account that I have turned over in my mind more than any other single thing, more even than the lights or the procession in the dark. There was a young girl living in the city, perhaps 7 or 8 years old by appearance, who Walter and I had both noticed early on because she was unusually curious about us. She would watch us from doorways, follow at a distance when we walked through the streets, occasionally offer a shy, careful smile when we caught her watching. Her name, as best we could understand it through translation, was something close to Lyra. One of the women who occasionally helped translate for us told us, almost in passing, that Lyra had been missing for some years as a much younger child and had returned to the city only recently. I did not think much of this at the time. Children get lost and found in any community. It seemed like an unremarkable piece of local history. It was only when I pressed for more detail, gently, carefully, the way I'd learned to ask things in that place, that I understood what was actually being told to me. Lyra had gone missing, by this woman's account, more than 15 years before we arrived. She had wandered off as a small child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, and had simply never been found despite searching. The community had mourned her. And then, some years later, the woman was vague about exactly how many, which by now did not surprise me at all. Lyra had simply reappeared at the edge of the city, alive, healthy, and looking, as far as anyone could tell, exactly the same age as the day she had vanished. I asked, as carefully as I knew how, whether that meant Lyra was now older than she appeared. The woman looked at me with an expression I can only describe as patient confusion, the look you give someone who has asked a question so strange that you're not entirely sure how to begin correcting their misunderstanding. She told me, through the limited words we shared, that Lyra was exactly as old as she looked. That time, for her, had simply stopped during the years she was gone and had only started again once she came back. I wrote that down in my journal that night with a hand that was shaking badly enough that some of the words are barely legible even now. I have read it back so many times since that I know the page by heart, regardless. It was around this point, call it the 3rd week of our stay, with Henry gone and Walter and I both growing more frightened with every passing day, that I began to notice the change in the residents themselves after dark. During the daylight hours, they remained exactly as warm and welcoming as they had been from our very first afternoon there. But something shifted once evening came on, something subtle that I noticed before Walter did, though he came to see it too before the end. Conversations grew shorter after dusk. Eye contact lingered a half-second too long in a way that felt less like warmth and more like attention, like assessment. People who had laughed easily with us during the day grew quiet and watchful once the light started going gold and then grey. It was nothing I could have pointed to and called proof of anything, nothing I could have written into an official survey report without sounding like a man whose nerves had gotten the better of him. But Walter and I talked about it, quietly, in our room, and we agreed without much discussion that we did not want to be in that city after dark for very much longer. We decided to leave. Not abruptly, and we were frightened, but we were not foolish, and we knew that leaving abruptly might draw the kind of attention we were trying to avoid. We told our hosts, through the translator, that we needed to return to report our findings to our sponsoring institution, that more men would need to come to properly continue the survey work, the same kind of polite, plausible excuse that explorers of that era used constantly. They received this news with what seemed like genuine sadness, and what I remember most clearly even now is that nobody tried to stop us, nobody made it difficult. They simply helped us prepare, gave us supplies for the journey, and wished us well in a manner that felt, on its surface, entirely sincere. It was the night before we left that I saw the thing I have never told anyone about until right now. I could not sleep. I think some part of me already understood that I needed to see whatever there was left to see because I might never have another chance. And despite everything, despite the fear that had been building in me for weeks, some old explorer's curiosity in me was still awake even as the rest of me wanted only to run. I went to the window of the guest house some time after the lights had gone out across the city, and this time, instead of simply standing there and waiting for the sounds to fade, I made myself watch. I saw the same slow procession I had glimpsed before, shapes moving through the dark toward the eastern edge of the valley, toward that lowest point that had always been kept from us. But this time, perhaps because my eyes had adjusted more fully, or perhaps because the moon was a little brighter that particular night, I saw something I hadn't seen before. As the procession reached the edge of the city, where the ground sloped down toward those forbidden stone structures, I saw light, not the warm, ordinary light of lanterns, but something pale and cold, rising up from somewhere beneath the ground itself, as though the earth down there had its own source of illumination that owed nothing to fire. And I saw, carved into a great standing stone near the entrance to that lower area, lit faintly by that strange, rising light, symbols. I had noticed similar markings once or twice before, in smaller forms worked into door frames and the corners of certain buildings throughout the city, and had assumed them to be decorative, the kind of folk art you find in any old culture. But this carving was different, larger, deeper, more deliberate, covering the entire face of that standing stone in patterns that meant nothing to me, and yet somehow filled me with a dread I cannot properly explain to you even now. I do not know what those symbols meant. I never learned. I only know that looking at them, even from a distance, even in poor light, made something in the very back of my mind insist, with absolute certainty, that I was looking at something that predated the city itself by a very long time, and that whatever lived in that city now had inherited those symbols rather than created them. I watched the procession disappear down into that lower ground, swallowed by the pale light, and I did not wait to see what happened next. I went back to my bed, and I did not sleep at all that night, and when the grey light of morning finally came, I woke Walter before the sun was even fully up, and told him we were leaving that very hour, whatever excuse we had to give. We left within the day. Our hosts walked with us part way up the ridge, helped carry some of our supplies, and parted from us with what still, even now, looking back across 90 years, felt like real warmth, real sorrow at our departure. I remember an old woman, one of the few people in that city whose face showed even the faintest suggestion of age, more than anyone else I'd seen there, though still nowhere close to what a woman of her apparent bearing should have shown, took my hand before we parted and said something to me through the translator that I have never fully made peace with. She said, "You will not remember the way back here." And then she smiled, the same gentle smile everyone in that city seemed to carry, and let go of my hand. She was right. Walter and I made our way back down out of those mountains, and I tried, for years afterward, to retrace the route on paper, to mark the valley properly on a map, so that someone, someday, might be able to find it again and learn what I had not managed to learn myself. I never could do it. The terrain simply would not resolve itself correctly in my memory, no matter how many times I tried to walk through it again in my mind. Certain stretches of that journey are vivid to me even now, the cold, the particular slant of certain ridgelines, the smell of the smoke rising from that city on our first evening, looking down at it. but the precise path, the actual route a person would need to follow to find that valley again, simply isn't there in my memory. I have come to believe, after a great deal of time turning it over, that it was taken from me as deliberately as it was once given. Walter and I parted ways within a year of returning to civilization. I think, in honesty, that we could not be around each other without being reminded of what we'd seen, and what we'd lost, and what we could never properly explain to anyone who asked us about the expedition. He died in 1958 of ordinary causes, an ordinary man living an ordinary life, and as far as I know, he never spoke publicly about that valley either. I attended his funeral. I wanted, very badly, to say something to his family about what we had shared, and in the end, I said nothing at all because I did not know how to begin, and because some part of me still believed, even then, 20 years removed from that place, that speaking of it too freely might somehow call its attention back toward me. I am 100 years old now, and I think I have finally outlived whatever fear kept me silent for so long. I do not know who those people in that valley truly were. I do not know why they did not age, or why none of them showed any sign of illness, or what exactly happened to Henry Voss, or what happened to little Lyra during the years she was gone before she came back, exactly as young as the day she disappeared. I do not know what those symbols beneath the city meant, or what was happening during that nightly procession into the dark, or why every light in that entire city went out within the same handful of seconds every single night, as though some single will controlled them all at once. I never went back. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters. I have read, over the decades, of expeditions into similar remote ranges, and every single time some old, stubborn part of me has wondered whether I should try to find that valley again, should try to get real answers instead of carrying a lifetime of unresolved fear. I never did it. I told myself, for years, that the terrain was simply too dangerous for a man my age, and that was certainly true for most of my life. But, if I am honest with you, the way I am trying to be honest with you now, age was never really the reason. The reason was that old woman's voice, telling me I would not remember the way back, and meaning, I have always believed, something far larger than simple geography. Even now, after 90 years, I dream about that valley. Not often, not the way you might dream about something that happened to you yesterday. But every so often, perhaps a few times a year, I am back there, standing at that guest house window in the total dark, watching shapes move slowly toward that pale, rising light at the edge of the city. And in the dream, unlike in life, I always find myself walking outside, always find myself following, and I wake before I learn what I would have seen if I had actually done it all those years ago. I am too old now to ever go looking for the truth myself. I do not know if anyone else ever will, or if that valley is even still there, hidden in whatever fold of those mountains it occupied, still lit by lanterns that all go dark together every single night, still home to people who do not age and do not sicken and do not speak about the world outside their valley. I only know what I saw and what I have carried in silence for the better part of a century, and I think, finally, at the very end of my life, that carrying it alone any longer would be its own kind of waste. So I have told you, that is all I can offer. The rest of it, what it means, what was really happening in that valley, whether any part of it can still be found, that, I am afraid, will have to belong to someone younger than I have any right to be anymore.